New year, same great savings. All in the Kroger app.
Get 10 for $10 on select varieties of Kroger pasta, Starkist tuna pouches, or Powerade with your card. Then get 3-pound packs of flavorful Kroger 80% lean ground beef for $3.99 a pound with your card and a digital coupon.
Shop these deals at your local Kroger, less than 5 miles away. Or tap the screen now to download the Kroger app to save big today. Kroger, fresh for everyone. Prices and product availability subject to change. Restrictions apply. See site for details.
This is a Hat Trick
podcast.
Oh, lovely.
Right, everyone, I just want to give you a heads up that the text we're talking about in this episode, well, it contains adult themes and, some explicit language. So, please listen to the episode before sharing with younger students or children to make sure that you're completely comfortable for them to listen. All right, buckle up, on with the show.
Hello, Jimmy.
Hello, Armand. Now, this week, we're talking about love. And I have to say, when I read the poems by this poet we're about to discuss when I was a young man, when I was 17, I thought this man had been reading my mail because it's like he climbed inside my head and he absolutely encapsulated what it was like to be young and to be on fire with love.
Yes, well, that's right. We're going to talk about Catullus,
Yep.
a young man who fell in love with a young woman who he thought was the love of his life, but things weren't that straightforward.
They never are. Now, we've got some breaking news on this podcast, haven't we?
Yes, I think this woman has been misidentified for centuries, actually. So we'll talk about how that happened and who we think the Lesbia of Catullus actually is.
Can't wait to hear that. Okay, so tell me more about Catullus.
So this is Catullus, Gaius Valerius Catullus, Roman poet who writes around 50 BC, fell in love with a young married woman, or at least fell in love with a young woman who eventually became married in her youth. And they had an affair. And so Catullus fell in love with her. He wrote these poems about his affair with a girl. That's what he calls her in Latin, puella. Only she was a promiscuous type, which explains the affair in the first place. And she went on to have affairs with lots of other men too. And he gets angry. And he writes some really rather unpleasant poems about her, having first written some romantic ones. And he sums up his feelings of love in one of these poems, that is poem 85, which is an elegiac epigram. So it has a particular metrical structure where you have a slightly longer line followed by a slightly shorter line. And it goes, I hate and I love, odi et amor in Latin. Perhaps you ask, how both of these I do? I don't know. But I feel it, and it's tearing me in two. That's the epigram. 2 lines in Latin. And it begins with these words, which look so contradictory and indeed are, I hate and I love. And then it goes on to ask, well, I've translated the word in Latin quare as how, because I think that what he is saying, someone is going to ask if they hear him say, I hate and love, is how is that possible that you do these contradictory things? Right. It's often translated why, because later Latin, it did mean why. Actually, in the Latin of Catullus' time, in 50 BC, there's lots of evidence that it meant how. And I think it's got to mean how, because he asks the question, you might want to know how it's possible that I do these 2 contradictory things. That is what someone is likely to ask, right? Mm-hmm. They're not going to say, why are you doing that? They can say, how? How is it possible? Yeah. And he responds, I don't know. I just feel it. It's tearing me in two. The word is excrucior in Latin. It's excruciating, but, the word, of course...
Etymology, though.
Yeah, it relates to the word crux. And in the centre of that word is the word cross. And being torn apart on the cross is literally what excrucior means. I'm being torn apart in 2 directions. Of course, one direction leading towards love, the other leading towards hate. So it's not just a bland metaphor. It's excruciating, it's tormenting. It is literally tearing me apart. And this is someone who, in the early parts of the relationship, he writes this incredibly romantic poetry about this young woman, this puella, about, for example, showering kisses on her. His poem 5, he says, let's live, my Lesbia, and love one another. And those old men who carp and grouse together, let's count as weighing lighter than a feather. No, this is 2 young people talking about old people grousing about the fact that she's married and he's having an affair with him. He says, the sun can set before returning bright, but we, once we've departed this brief light, must sleep one long and everlasting night. Kiss me 1,000 times, 100 more, 1,000 times again, and then 5 score, another 1,000, then 100 more. So this is very romantic stuff. Then, he says, when we've scores of thousands on account, we'll churn them up and blot out the amount, so that no jealous type can jinx our tryst, because they know how many times we've kissed. And that's a reference to ancient magic, where if you know something about someone, if you know their name or where they live, you can put a curse on it. So here the idea is, you've got all these kisses. If somebody knew exactly how many, they jinx it by putting a spell on us. And so, although we can actually count up the kisses in this poem, he's 1,000, then 100, and another, it actually comes to 3,300. But no, let's not go there. Let's not name the number, because he says, let's just churn them all up. Conturbabimus illa. Let's churn them all up so that nobody knows how many times you kiss and can put their evil eyes on us. So this is the poem of a young man and a young girl having an affair.
So she's a married woman? Or
a married girl.
Yeah.
And she falls in love with Catullus. They fall in love with each other. He writes this poem. You once said you had eyes for me alone and would not sooner sleep with Jove on high. I loved you then, not with mere vulgar lust, but in the way a father loves a child. So you can see that sort of, he's thinking of her as a younger person. I know you now, so fiercer though I yearn, you're cheaper and less special in my eyes. How can that be? Because such grave offence increases passion, but makes love less fond. And that then explains odi et amo. How is it possible that he can hate and love someone? Well, because she is being unfaithful to him, and that he actually uses that term, even though, of course, she's unfaithful to her husband, but he's unfaithful to their relationship.
Is he saying it because she's with her husband, or she's actually she's got other lovers apart from... He's just one of many lovers.
Exactly. And he tells us in other poems, she has, in fact, he tells us in one poem, she has 300 lovers.
Right.
And he's obviously exaggerating, but she went on to have loads of other lovers, this young girl. One imagines that Gaius Pompey, who was the son of Pompey the Great, was a soldier. He was off on campaign. His married wife, this young woman, was having lots of promiscuous affairs, one of which was with Catullus. But when she goes off with other men, he can't bear it. So he's still in love with her, as he says, fiercer though I yearn, you're cheaper and less special, because your infidelity, a word in Latin is inuria, the injustices that you do me, increase my passion, but make me less fond of you. And so I think that explains, if he was to be asked, why do you feel hate and love? He has the answer. Because I've got a girlfriend whom I'm in love with, but who is being promiscuous and letting me down. And so I hate her for that, but I love her all the more.
But also the question, he says, you may be thinking it's an impossible thing to do, to love and hate. Well, I don't know how that I do that, but I do feel it, and it's killing me. But actually, modern psychologists would tell you it's very common to love and to hate. There's been recent work done by a team of psychologists called Ziki and Romaya, and they wrote a paper in 2008, and they looked at people's brains while viewing images of the people that they loved or hated. The results revealed that some of the same brain areas were activated in the two conditions. When you loved somebody and you hated somebody, the same part of the brain was activated. One of those areas is called the insula. It's a brain region that determines the intensity of an emotion and how strongly we take it to be associated with what we perceive, in this case, the person. The insula does not determine whether the emotion is positive or negative. Hate and love thus both seem to be involved in the neural processing of what is sometimes referred to as the arousal effect of emotion. It can be positive, it can be negative. And there's a thing called OLD, old, which is obsessive love disorder. It's an overwhelming attraction to one person, obsessive thoughts about one person, feeling the need to protect the person you're with, extreme jealousy over other interpersonal interactions.
Well, that's what he's got.
I think Catullus has got OLD, hasn't he?
Definitely. That's what it is so wonderful about his poetry. That's what I love it, that you feel, you know what this young man is going through.
Yeah.
I mean, we've all had OLD at some stage.
Yeah. I remember writing out a passage of Wuthering Heights and sending it to a girlfriend. I was 16 or 17 and thinking, she needs to know how I feel. And I think that's interesting, is that the opposite of love then clearly is not hate. It's indifference, because Catullus is obviously very wrapped up with this girl. To spend that much energy hating somebody and loving them.
Absolutely. I think he actually talks about Lesbia in those terms when he talks about her with her husband. He writes a poem, it's poem 83, and he says, Lesbia badmouths me intensely when her husband's there. He thinks it's quite hilarious. That dimwit, how he hoots. You donkey, don't you get it? Don't you see she wouldn't care if she was silent? But the way she jabbers on and snoots shows not just that I'm in her thoughts, but even clearer still, she's riled. That is, she's hot for me and needs to talk her fill. So he makes that very clear, that psychological idea that she's also angry with him and she's thinking about him and she's saying, what an awful man that Catullus is. You can imagine this young girl trying to say, what a dreadful person Catullus is to her husband, and he's laughing his head off, thinking she's just being funny about this idiot. This idiotic poet who clearly has been, making eyes at his wife.
He's on the front foot, isn't he? He thinks she should be with me. She's missing out on something here. I'm worth it, and she can't see it. She's off with these other people.
Yes, that's right. Yes, he does think that she is better off with him.
Yeah.
Even though she's a married girl, but, nonetheless, if she's going to have an affair, then she might as well have it with him. He writes a poem at the end of their relation, what looks like at least a pause in it, where he tells himself that it's over, and he's got to recognise that it's over, but he can't quite get there. So he starts the poem, he says, Love-lorn Catullus, stop being such a fool. What you see has ended, count as done. Time was the sun shone burning bright for you, when you would tag along behind your girl, loved by me as no woman will be loved. That time when lots of fun and games were had, which you were keen on, nor was she unkeen. Truly the sun shone blazing bright for you. Now she's not keen, so you, hopeless, don't be too. Don't seek a girl who flees, or court vain hopes, but let your heart grow hard, be resolute. Goodbye, girl. Now Catullus is steadfast, he won't chase you, since you're no longer keen. But you'll be sad when you're not chased at all. Damn you, poor bitch! What will your life hold then? Who'll visit you? Who'll feast their eyes on you? Who'll be your lover, boast that you're his girl? Who will you kiss? Whose soft lips will you bite? But you, Catullus, drop it. Stand resolved. This amazing poem where he says it's over, but then he can't resist saying, poor you won't have a life without me. And that then turns into jealousy. Who is it going to be? Who's your lover?
It reminds me of this is definitely oversharing. Oh, sod it. When I was a young man, I was about 24, I had split up with a girlfriend and I was feeling very sorry for myself. I had far too much to drink and I rang her up at 3 o'clock in the morning. She picked the phone up and I said, can I come over? I'm not, I'm feeling a bit down in the mouth. And I gave her a real sob story. And she said, no, Jimmy, it's finished. It's over. So my blandishments and cajoling hadn't worked. So I ended up getting very angry and saying to her, you'll never meet anyone like me ever again, to which she said, I bloody well hope not, and put the phone down. And so I kind of empathise with Catullus, because it's like you're grasping at straws at that point. You're going, all right, then you'll have a miserable life without me. How about that? Do we know who the girl is? Can we identify her?
Right, okay. So her name in the poems is Lesbia, which means a girl or a woman from Lesbos, the island of Lesbos.
So it doesn't mean that she's a lesbian?
No, it doesn't, because Lesbia, meaning a girl from Lesbos, was most famously used of the poet Sappho, because she came from the island of Lesbos. She composed her songs around 600 BC.
Obviously, we use the word lesbian about Lesbos, implying that Sappho herself wrote poetry, love poetry about other women.
Which she did.
Right.
And that's why the term lesbian emerged in the early 19th century to mean lesbian as we use it today. But it didn't mean that before.
Right.
And Sappho herself, yes, she wrote poetry in which she talks about her love for other women, but she also was known to have been married and to have fallen in love with a man. So it wasn't absolutely clear that she was simply a lover of women. She was that as well.
Right.
So her name's Lesbia, that's what she's called, and therefore it implies a woman or a girl of some culture.
That's a nickname in the poem.
It's a pseudonym.
Yeah.
And we're told by someone a lot later, in fact, 150 years later, the novelist Apuleius says, Well, everyone knows that Catullus' Lesbia was really Clodia.
And who's she?
Well, who is Clodia? Now, 200 years later, one might think it could be any Clodia.
It's quite a common name.
Yeah, what it means is someone from the clan of the Claudii. The Claudii is just a spelling.
And we have Claudia, don't we, as a name?
We have Claudia as a name. The sort of colloquially would turn that O into an O, Claudia. And that's who she was. But then he doesn't tell us which Claudia. And in about the 16th century, an Italian Renaissance scholar thinks, well, there is a very famous Claudia at the same time. And she is the wife of a man called Metellus, a senator. And she is talked about in similar terms by Cicero in his oration, the Pro Caelio. He's speaking on behalf of a young man called Caelius, who has been seduced by this promiscuous older woman, and her name is Clodia, wife of Metellus, Clodia Metelli, as she's known.
Because when I was a kid and we came across this, that's what we were told. But since then...
Well, we've always been told that. In fact, I was teaching that myself, I'm afraid, until 2010. In 2010, something happened. I was in Oxford and a man came along who's actually a physicist from America called John Morgan II.
Can't trust them.
And he is a devotee of Catullus. And he started by showing us images of young women with birds from the ancient world. So what you see is a girl holding a bird as a pet. And he said all these images, and there were over a dozen, he says, show that if you had a pet sparrow or a pet bird, you were a young girl. There are no older women. Now, so this is where he started. And of course, one of the things about Catullus' girl is that she had a pet sparrow. So there are two poems about the passer. Yeah. So she has this sparrow, which in one poem she's using as a substitute for her love. She's allowing it to comfort her. This is what Catullus says. It's perhaps before they've met. And he says, I wish I had a sparrow that could comfort me because I'm in love with you and you're in love with me and you're using your sparrow. But then the second poem, the sparrow's dead. And so he writes this extravagant lament. Oh, poor sparrow, you're going down to Hades, he says. But it's a poem which ends with, damn you, he says, sparrow, because of you, my darling girl's eyes are red and sore with weeping. So the idea is he doesn't really care about the sparrow. He just cares about the effect its death has had on his girl. So it's a funny poem. So those sparrow poems have been long thought to have double entendres. Is the sparrow a phallus of some kind, or something of that kind? I think
that would certainly kill a sparrow if you tried to use it as one.
I don't think it can be. I mean, in one of the poems it says, the sparrow who used to hop up and down on your breast, fair enough. But it used to nip your finger. I mean, how many phalluses nip a woman's finger? I mean, no, it can't be that, I think.
It's always funny to me, though, when I read something like that, when I was studying classics, is you come across something like a pet sparrow, and it would really pull me out thinking, who keeps a pet sparrow? But of course they had lots of odd things that they would keep as pets.
Well, that, as I say, that was the pet of choice for young girls. And this is what John Morgan showed us. That was his first proof that she can't be Clodia, the wife of Metellus, because Clodia, the wife of Metellus, would have been around 40, perhaps in her late 30s, when this young poet, Catullus, was writing about her in the 50s BC. Now, that identification had actually been exploded in the 1980s and 90s by a great Latinist called Peter Wiseman. And he'd written books showing chronologically it just doesn't work. But he hadn't found a suitable candidate. But what happened in 2010 was that John Morgan had been looking into other possible Clodias, and we know more than the fact that she was a Clodia because Catullus jokes about the name Clodius Pulcher in another poem. So she would have been Clodia Pulchra. So we know her surname, as it were. It means Clodia the Fair, Clodia the Beautiful. And he looked for other Clodia Pulchras, and he found a few that we know of, some who exist. And then a friend of his, John Ramsay is known, another Latinist in America, found a letter written to Cicero in which the correspondent says, you know that idiot Gaius Pompey. And that idiot in Latin, fatuus, is the word. We use the word fatuus as well, but in Latin it's an unusual word meaning, that dimwit, is also a word used by Catullus of the husband of his beloved girl. He's a fatuous man. He's a dimwit. And so immediately that seemed to be the obvious Clodia Pulchra, and then it all fell into place.
Right.
Because she would have been in her teens when Catullus was in his early 20s.
And girls would be married by then.
Yeah, she would be married.
I have to say, listening to all this, I am relieved that I'm not in that place now, that it's a different place to be. It is agony being that age and, falling for someone hard and not having it fully requited.
I think that Catullus does actually resonate with young men, and this sense of extreme passion and then sense of being let down. And yes, his rather unpleasant comments about the woman who's let him down as well. But all that feels very human to us, even if it's not acceptable to say it all very publicly now. But I think we tend to associate that kind of passion with younger men on the whole, rather than with the more settled older man and woman who have a hopefully happily married life together. And I think we have to accept that certainly for Catullus, he was always in his 20s. He never wrote beyond that because he died at 30.
It would have been interesting, wouldn't it? Had he lived till he was 50,
who knows what kind of
what his views on love would have been. Captain Corelli's mandolin, Louis de Bernier. I'm just going to read this. He talks about love. When you fall in love, it's a temporary madness. It erupts like an earthquake and then it subsides. And when it subsides, you have to make a decision. You have to work out whether your roots are so entwined together that it's inconceivable you should ever part. Because that is what love is. Love is not breathlessness. It's not excitement. It is not the desire to mate every second of the day. It is not lying awake at night imagining that he's kissing every part of your body. No, don't blush. I'm telling you some truths. For that is just being in love, which any of us can convince ourselves we are. Love itself is what is left over when being in love has burned away. Doesn't sound very exciting, does it? But it is.
Well, there are other poets who talk about that. Horace is one, and we'll talk about him some other time, about the joy of a steady marital relationship. Catullus never really gets there. He wants a steady relationship with this girl who he is in love with, frankly in love with.
If Catullus went into therapy now, do you not think that there'd be a case to be made that he wasn't really in love with the person? He was in love with the agonized feelings. And there are people who are attracted to people who are unavailable so they can recycle this desperate feeling of not being wanted. And it's a kind of addiction to that feeling as opposed to being truly attracted to the person. He needs to have a very screwed up relationship in order to write this poetry. So my next question to you is, who's he writing it for? Because was he popular in his day? Is he writing for an audience? And does he know this stuff is going to go down well?
So he can't have been writing for a contemporary audience. Certainly not the Lesbia poems, it seems to me. Couldn't have gone out there because people would have known who he was having an affair with. It would have been dangerous if it was known that he was having an affair with the wife of Gaius Pompeius. But he would have circulated them to his friends, and he wrote these poems of love, having returned from a tour of duty in Asia Minor, which is modern Turkey, where elite Romans, which he was one, would have gone off on this tour of duty, and he went to a province of Rome called Bithynia, which was in Asia Minor, and he actually writes a poem about it, which I'd like to read.
Okay.
Because it's quite fun, and it shows his kind of colloquial tone and also his humour. Mm. So he says, I'm idling in the square when my mate Varus drags me away to meet his new amour. A little slapper is my first impression, quite pretty though, and not without allure. We fall to chatting about sundry matters, like how I'd found it serving in Bithynia, and how much cash I'd raked in from the trip. I told them how it was. Not even bosses, much less their aides, could make a decent tip or add a measly penny to their coffers, especially as the praetor was a bugger who didn't give a toss about his staffers. At least, she says, you won't have missed the chance to get the local product, litter bearers. Keen to impress the girl and make her fancy I'm not some loser, I reply, you betcha, a rotten province, but that didn't stop me from bringing home 8 able-bodied bearers. The truth is, I can't claim a single bearer, not there nor here in Rome, not even one who could hoist a broken bedpost on his shoulders. But then the little tart says, "Oh, Catullus, my darling, can you lend me them? I need them to make a little trip. I have an appointment at Serapis' temple." "Wait," I stammer. "I should have said, look, they aren't mine to lend you. You see, they're my friend Cinna's, that is Gaius Cinna, just mine to use if I should want to." "But you're a nuisance and a tiresome hag to trip me up in an unguarded brag." So there he is, telling this story to his own disadvantage, really, because he's trying to pretend to this girl who he thinks is quite fanciable, his mate's girlfriend, that he's done well from his tour of duty, which is something that was possible to do if you went to a province where the praetor, the governor, would fleece the locals and everybody would share out some of the booty. But in this particular case, he doesn't have the litter. It's a bit like he's showing off about having managed to acquire a fast car, and then she says, "Well, can you lend it to me?" And he says, "Well, actually, it's not mine, it's my friend's." And, she says, "I want to go off to Serapis' temple," which is where apparently there were gynecological conditions were treated in ancient Rome.
Right.
So there are probably a lot of in-jokes in that story. But he's telling a story about how he's returned from Bithynia and he's caught bragging about some acquisition of his that he doesn't actually have. So that's just to show the kind of chattiness that we get in these short poems by Catullus. And almost certainly must have been him who organised his poetry into this book of 116 poems, which miraculously survives. And then he probably died, and it was then put out into circulation. But I suspect these poems can't have been heard and read while he was still having an affair with this girl.
Yeah.
Catullus himself, who's he writing for? He dedicates his book to a historian called Cornelius Nepos, and we have some of the work of Cornelius Nepos, but we know that he wrote a large history of the world, so he was a serious historian. And this is something that Catullus alludes to in his very first introductory poem, which, of course, you write last when you create a book. You then put the dedication at the front. It's a very short poem. And he says, "Whom shall I give this smart new little book, just polished smooth with crispy pumice stone, Cornelius, to you, since you are prone to think my trifles worth a second look." He calls his poetry trifles, Latin nugae. "Yes, even when alone in Italy, you ventured on a history of the world, setting it forth in 3 papyrus scrolls, a learned and by Jove exacting task. So now, whatever it's worth, accept this little book, and Goddess Muse, I ask, may it survive a century or more." That's what he asks, and it is wonderful to think that his little book has survived 2,000 years. It could almost have been lost by the faults of transmission. We don't always know whether things that survive because they were copied enough times, or whether they were good enough or famous enough. So in this particular case, it survived as he has asked, even though he essentially says these are trifles. He doesn't think this is great poetry. Catullus himself is saying these are little bits of fun, and a lot of them are very scurrilous, very naughty. Some of them are just amusingly colloquial, like the one about Varus showing him his girlfriend. Some of them are intense love poems, such as the ones we've looked at. But it's a real collection of different things that add up to the life of a poet and a lover.
And so he got his wish. I mean, which is, I suppose, the secret wish of everybody who puts pen to paper is, I wonder if I'm writing something of...
Or even the not-so-secret wish.
The
poets have said, my poetry will last forever.
Yeah, I wish some hadn't bothered, to be honest. But as a young man reading Catullus, it really did speak to me. And looking back on it now, I can see that, he points to things which are, in many ways, he's chatting to us.
Yes.
And that's the thing about a lot of this literature is it's not, people think about, oh God, the classics is so heavy. It's not actually. It's full of this stuff, isn't it? It's full of stuff which is funny, smart, rude. I mean, some of the poems we could not translate and put out, even on a podcast, it would offend people. He's pornographic in some of it. So he's kind of not prim and proper by any means.
Not pulling his punches.
No. I think that's what's so exciting about this stuff that you and I are talking about and you're bringing to this, is that it's just proof that if you look at this stuff, yes, it's 2,000 years old, even older in the case of Greek literature, but it's fresh and it speaks to you and it gets you thinking about who you are in this moment. Brilliant.
Thank you.
It's All Greek and Latin to Me is presented by Armand and Jimmy Mulville. The producer is Diggory Waite, and the executive producer is Claire Broughton. It's All Greek and Latin to Me is a hat-trick podcast.
Hi everyone, I just wanted to give a mention to Classics for All. Classics for All is a charity, and what we want to do is provide access to the classics to as many state school pupils as possible, alongside training teachers who don't actually have to have any previous training in the subject. They hope that they make classics a sustainable part of the school curriculum. If you want to find out more about this fantastic charity, go to the website. It's www.classicsforall.org.uk.